Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to everyone. The session is being recorded, so just say this from the outset. Welcome to our today's seminar. We will be hosting Professor Fosu from ISSER and the University of Legon in Ghana. He's a professor of development economics and the economics of Africa, I guess, if he's happy with that characterization. And he'll be talking about FDI and export diversification in Africa. We'll also be hosting Professor Evans Osavoyen, who's Evans, do you want to maybe turn the camera on for a sec? So Evans is the head of the Department of Economics at Continental University in Nigeria. And I would also read out the acronym. He's also the chair of the Center for Economic Policy and Development Research, CEPDeR, I think it's pronounced, at Continental University. He'll be talking to us about trade and export in the context of Africa and the opportunities that they can open, and also the interlinkages between them. Let's start with Augustin, if that's okay.
Yes, that's perfectly fine. Thank you very much, Serena. This is my topic, FDI and export diversification in Africa. The question here is, does FDI promote export diversification? But why are you interested in export diversification to begin with? Because export diversification is critical, it's crucial for long-term economic growth and development. It tends to mitigate instabilities, it tends to promote growth, and a bunch of other things. So it is the objective that we like to obtain, that's export diversification. So in terms of literature on the role of FDI, much has been done on the impact of FDI on growth, on inclusive growth, on the possibility of probably improving the techniques in various countries, etc. But there's not really much in terms of its role in terms of improving export diversification, which is something that many African countries have been striving for all these years. I'm not even sure that has been a type of success, right? All right. Now, recently, well, there are other studies, but most of them are actually country specific. But most recently, I tried to kind of dabble in this particular literature by looking at the role of infrastructure in terms of making FDI kind of what they call EDS for diversification enhancing. Right. So the next question is, what are the other factors that may play us in the role? And here I would like to focus on human capital, that is education. So let's look at some nice pictures. The top one is the measure of export diversification based on the THAL index for African countries. The lower one, the blue one, lower one, is for the global. Well, it turned out that this particular measure actually measures export concentration, not diversification. So the lower it is, then the greatest export diversification, and vice versa. All right. So if you look at first of all, the fact that the Africa one is above the global one means that there's less export diversification in Africa compared to global. Second, there's some dynamics. I mean, the trend is not linear. From about 1970 to 1985, there seemed to be decrease export diversification. And then from 85 to about 2001, there's increase in export diversification. And then there appears to be decrease in export diversification thereafter. So that's what the aggregate evidence shows. I'm getting some, okay. I wanted to show some evidence, country-specific evidence across countries, but I'm not getting the picture. It's blank. So I'll move on to the next one. In terms of the foreign direct investment, we find that there's this tremendous increase in foreign for FDI from 1995 onward. But we asked the question, for what? Whether this particular FDI, what is it going to do? Is it more FDI in the natural resources, or is it going towards improving export diversification? Oh, here it is. I think that came later. All right. So this is the evidence for this country-specific evidence. As we look at this, and we find what I've done here is I've taken the whole period, sample period 1970 to 2014, and then observed the increase or the changes in the index of export diversification, SDI. Then I look at the more recent period, 1991 to 2014, and then I ask the question, what is the level of diversification country-wise? Now let's look at the level of diversification. Those numbers don't tell us a whole lot, but what I've done here is to group them into quintile ranks. 5 means worst, and 1 means best. So in the case of Algeria, in 2014, its export diversification is ranked in 5 rank, quintile 5, which means that is among the worst. Angola, among the worst. If you go down to Egypt, among the best. And we can go on to others. Kenya, among the best. Morocco, among the best. And Sierra Leone, well, not so good. South Africa, among the best. Tanzania, Togo, Uganda, and so among the best ones. Okay. Then we can go back and look at the evolution. So for example, if you go all the way back to Algeria, Algeria doesn't do very well in terms of improvement as far as diversification. Angola is among the worst in terms of improvement since 1970. And Equatorial Guinea, among the worst, both overall period and then more recently, and so on and so on. So these quintile ranks will help us then classify these countries in terms of their evolution of export diversification. Okay, now, the conceptualization. And I'm doing this to find out the extent to which human capital, for example, might influence the export diversification propensity of FDI. So we assume the conceptualization that FDI, foreign firms, which are the FDI providers, are profit maximized. But that's a reasonable assumption. And operate well in national markets, they must cost minimize. So what they'll do then is they'll select the country or the set of countries that will help them cost minimize. And we assume that there's a continuum of foreign firms are specialized in different forms of export diversification, okay, FDI. So different intensities, and the question becomes, when is a given firm going to provide a given level of FDI that might result in a given level of export diversification? So that is the question that we ask, okay? I assume further here that the supply of FDI depends on host country conditions, such as availability of natural resources, tax incentives, infrastructure, capital, etc. So the ED enhancing FDI is a function of host country variables. It could be infrastructure, human capital, the other things. So a larger value of infrastructure or human capital might likely result in more ED enhancing FDI. I illustrated this point here using human capital. In the previous work that I did infrastructure. So this is a model specification. I know I'm not going to go into details of the model, but essentially we're interested in what determines export diversification, and so that's the D on the left-hand side. It is a function of is lag value. And then the F here is the FDI inflows. This is net inflows, by the way. And then we have the interaction between FDI and human capital H. Plus you have a bunch of other variables. These are international, institutional, structural, and policy variables. I've just indicated and explained in other studies. So I'm not going to go through all of them here. And the rest of the stuff, the various error terms that you grade econometricians are very familiar with. Okay. What I would do here is to use various estimation procedures. And I use the pooled OLS, I use the GLS random effects, and the system GMM. So we can move swiftly to the results. This is the panel data, by the way, for the period. All right. Now, QLS is the pooled OLS, and then GLS-RE is the random effects, and the last one is system GMM. Now, if we look at human capital, we find that actually its effect on export diversification tends to be positive. By the way, let me once again indicate that the negative effect, okay, means that it improves export diversification because the index, as we indicated, is concentration. All right. So if you look at systems GMM, for example, there's a tendency for that to improve export diversification. But more importantly, we can look at FDI, and we find that FDI actually, with the low level of human capital, zero level of human capital, actually has a negative effect on export diversification. Okay, again, the positive coefficient means that it has a negative effect on export diversification. But if we interacted human capital, we find that the effect is positive. Okay, that is positive influence in export diversification. So these are essentially the results that we get. That is, human capital has a positive impact on the effect of FDI on export diversification. That's the results that we get here. So at the low levels of human capital, FDI is actually export diversification inhibiting. The threshold is about 3.5 years. But remember, this is a sample period that goes all the way to 1970. Okay, and the sample mean is 3.0 years of schooling. But of course, in more recent period, the average schooling will be much higher than that. That is on average, then, over the sample period, FDI has been what? Export diversification inhibiting in the African sample. Now, so note that human capital works through FDI and exerts little independent effect on export diversification. So to attract ED-enhanced FDI, a sufficient high level of human capital is critical. I present here the results on infrastructure which appeared in my previous article. And once again, we find that the interaction between FDI and infrastructure is indeed positive. Again, negative here means that the effect is indeed, the effect is positive, okay? As indicated, like, for example, the minus 0.0041, this side is significant, all right? We, and the infrastructure itself does have a positive impact on export diversification, as we can tell over here. All right. Now, if you look at the FDI itself, that is without infrastructure, if you will, we find that this effect is actually non-existent. Okay, so that is essentially it. What I've done here then is to identify two important factors that will tend to make FDI export diversification enhanced. Of course, there may be other policy instruments that can be used, but these are the instruments that need to be explored and identified. So Hopefully I've not exceeded my time. Thank you very much for listening to my speech. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot for the presentation. Shall we move on to the next one then, please? We'll be collecting questions at the end, so we can just move on straight to the next one.
Fosu, please, thank you. If you can stop sharing your screen, and I can share mine.
Just 1 second. Stop sharing.
Yes.
So now we can actually appreciate your background. It's beautiful background there, by the way.
Yeah, thank you so much. Appreciate you have my screen now. Yeah, can you see my screen?
Yeah, we can see it well.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much. Thank you, Serena, for the opportunity. And thank you so much, Prof. Fosu, for this kind of another time to have a joint session with you. And I think your talk has covered part of my discussion. So I'll focus on other areas. I don't want to repeat what you have said so well. By the way, I'm talking about Africa's development in post-COVID-19 world, focusing on unlocking the rules of AFTA and FDI. AFTA is simply Africa Continental Free Trade Area. So I'm talking about how we run through the discussion for the time I have. Following this outline, shortly I'll give introduction and then give us some historical insights on Africa development, and then narrow forward to COVID-19 and Africa development, and then look at the possible nexus between AFTA and FDI. And then this other discussion that is coming to my mind, I would like to put for a discussion as well, issue of rising religious development and how we can tap into that for integration Africa. Now I'll try to summarize and then conclude accordingly. So by way of introduction, as perhaps most of us will know in our ECO 101, that the role of trade and development cannot be overemphasized, because trade gives opportunity for countries to consume goods that they cannot produce effectively through imports, and then export goods that it has access to the rest part of the world. That is what AFTA is trying to provide opportunity for, how we can galvanize such opportunity across the continent. And on the other hand, like Fosu has eloquently given us a background on FDI and how that improve export diversification. So the point here is that FDI has been known to complement what we call DRM. DRM means domestic resource mobilization for development. In other words, FDI has a way of complementing domestic capital for development. So most countries, FDI are very important. Like Fosu argued, what another debate is what kind of FDI are we receiving in Africa and what kind of channeling is it put about? But that is have been covered by him. I will just look at other aspects. So moving forward, I will give us some historical insights on Africa development. In recent time, I tried to begin to reflect on what in terms of development is not news, that most of the development parameters or indicators, Africa tend to lag behind. Was it destined to be that? But we have some historical evidence that Africa was not actually made to be behind, but in the past, there were some development efforts that were made across the continent, which I will just shed light shortly. So I'll just to give us some point. Of course, the great development wonder of the Egyptian pyramid is still a puzzle for the world, and not only in Egypt. It was happening in Zimbabwe, for example, the Great Zimbabwe War, and in Nigeria, like the Benin Empire. Across different parts of Africa, there was some development paradigm that was happening. And like a recent report from BBC, it mentions that the continent of Africa has rich and interesting history in terms of development. But one point is noted was that most of these historical evidence are not actually well documented, which is one of the things that have aroused my interest in trying to reflect on this in some of my discussion in the last few years. Now, what again that I saw in my reading is that this development in Africa was actually unique because it was people-oriented, it was people-centered, and then this kind of general interest or communal interest, which was more emphasized than personal interest. And then whenever I have this kind of talk, there's this kind of question: Now, if Africa was developing this at this era, what happened? Of course, that's actually the debate of today. But there are some school of thought that have been put to discussion. Some say it's because of the issue of colonization. Some say it's issue of corruption. Some say it's issue of undermining the local institutions that were quite effective at that time. But like I said today, just to give us a historical insight, I'm not going to do such a debate for today. So I'll move us quickly now to the next point I want to talk about, which is COVID-19 and Africa development. Of course, except you are not staying on this part of on this earth. If you're on this earth, we all know what happened in 2020, COVID-19 lockdown and all that, and maybe some emerging discussion on that, how it affected different parts of the world. But our focus on this is on Africa, and I will just try to summarize some recent discussion that in the book we just completed, which will be released in the month of June. COVID-19 in the African continent, and it has some insight from different parts of Africa, from West Africa, East Africa, Southern Africa, Central Africa. I'll summarize the key messages from that particular text for different authors from different perspectives. Now, the summary is that even though COVID-19 seems to be challenging for the issue of lockdown and all of that, another issue is that it also gives a kind of, if you like, call it a wake-up call that can help us for what I call innovative and creative solution thinking that we can use to galvanize and turn these challenges into opportunities. For example, the issue of health sector, the issue of education, human capital. Fosu has given us a number of thoughts that I won't go to human capital. The issue of digitalization and services. Of course, this webinar is an example of such aftermath of COVID-19. Otherwise, I will see how we can meet physically, but now, right there in our offices, we can begin to interact with the world. So, though it was a challenge, but it's an opportunity to learn from. Of course, you also remember that health system in Africa was not, most African leaders seek health care outside of the continent. But when there was lockdown, there was nowhere to go. And so that is a kind of a wake-up call to be to rethink our idea of how we can make the health sector functional. Again, in education, we have seen a number of innovations whereby most education systems, even at level of primary school, secondary school, universities, have to adapt to online system. And even after the lockdown was over, many now undergo what they call blended learning, having the physical and the online solution. So these are summaries that there are issues, of course, yes, but they also present this kind of challenge, solutions, opportunities that we can leverage on in terms of development in the continent. So moving on to another point, which is which is the African Continental Area and FDI in Africa. So I will just give us some point on that and look at the possible networks and how we can unlock the potentials therein for development. So of course, as we have seen in some readings, we see that Africa houses about almost 1/5 of the global population, and the FDI, I mean the GDP is growing, and much more so. Some of the fastest growing economies of the world are actually in Africa. My other point is that in terms of intra-Africa trade is quite low, almost lower than most of part of the world. Another was Africa countries tend to trade outside the continent more than within the continent. Okay, and in summary, the African Continental Area, which is signed with Kigali in 2018 by 54 member countries, and interestingly, about at the end of last year, about half of them have ratified or domesticated such an agreement, so making it to be continental. Like some reports say that if the tenets in the agreement are followed up, it's going to be one of the largest single market in the world, which presents an opportunity for integration and for development within the continent of Africa. So I'll give us some data, and so this, like I said earlier, in terms of intra-African trade, in other words, trade within Africa, they want in green intra-African intra-trade, while they want in blue trade outside the region. So we see that in Africa, it's lower than 20% compared to elsewhere in the world, like Asia, Europe, where it was above 60, 70% as case may be. So the summary is that trade within Africa is among African countries themselves quite low compared to some part of the other regions. So how we quickly touch on FDI. This graph shows us between 2017 and 2020, focusing on the net FDI flows as a percentage of GDP for the country. So there are 2 points I want to emphasize here. We see this is a global average, and these are some part of the other regions. So within South African countries or region, we see that it's a bit lower than the global average. And then generally, between 2017 and 2021, 2020, we see a kind of reduction in FDI inflow. But that is quite understood. And one of the reasons is not far-fetched. Many of us attribute that to the issue of COVID-19 that occurred and the lockdown in 2020. Okay, so I will put that now. I want to mention quickly on what are the roles, or how can we unlock the roles of AFTA and FDI. In other words, Tony, there are a number of challenges and how we can harness these challenges into opportunities. So in brief, so we know that there are great opportunities, particularly in terms of employment. FDI occurs the issue of employment and employment of not just human resource, physical resource as well. And then it gives for entrepreneurship to develop, business development, management skills are transferred among many others, which we are familiar with in the literature. And much more so, like I mentioned earlier, the AFTA itself, we create a kind of a single market for goods and services, which I said earlier, if that is well done, it will be one of these single largest free trade area in the world. And so not only on trade, it also helps to liberalize and facilitate the movement of people, investment, basically across the continent. Of course, all of these are imperative for development within the continent. So in other words, the summary of AFTA is that it will integrate the continent, diversify the continent, and industrialize the African economies. So these are some of the opportunities or the tenets that AFTA hopes to achieve. And now, as some of us already know, the headquarters already been organized in Accra, Ghana, and human resources have been put in place to start off accordingly, so that the opportunity can begin to tap into that resources. So now, next point I want to talk about quickly is to harness some of the challenges that may need to be addressed if the opportunities in FDI as well as AFTA can be harnessed. One crucial one is the issue of insecurity and conflicts. Of course, capital or FDI cannot flow to areas of conflict as we expect. For example, the challenges we have seen in xenophobia in South Africa and other parts of Africa. So other kind of communal clashes, conflicts are quite issues. So if we must optimize the opportunities in AFTA and FDI, the issue of security and conflict need to be well addressed. And then another area is the issue of a weak institutional framework. Okay, I didn't put the data here. Most of the institutional indicators we have seen in Africa continent, they are always lower than the global average and other part of the world. So they need to have a kind of strong institution that will drive such process. And then the issue of infrastructure, Professor Fosu have given us insight on that, whether hard infrastructure like roads, railway, electricity provision, or soft infrastructure like broadband, internet connectivity. These are all crucial for integration or trade as well as FDI attraction, even for AFTA to be optimized. The one major area again to emphasize the issue of need to work on the issue of a weak agri-value chain or supply chain. So we cannot make the error of other resources whereby we export raw materials, because there's need for processing, packaging, and especially because some of the records we've seen of our empirical research is that most of the returns from the agri sector, more than 80% of the returns there are actually in off-farm, instead of processing, packaging, and so if you must harness such potential, there's need to work on the processing and packaging distribution instead of to develop the sector, which will create employment and all of that. So these are crucial areas that are challenges, but it can be also harnessed for development or as well as integration for AFTA. Okay, now this other discussion I started having with one of my friends who studied him 2 weeks ago for University of Chicago, and he's looking at religion and development. And I said, wait a minute, can we not upscale this kind of discussion into continental discussion? In other words, we have seen churches becoming much more relevant in terms of development. They are involved in human capital development, in terms of operating all levels of education, primary education, secondary education, even universities, and they have a kind of real estate across different parts of the world. I've seen, for example, a religious body established in Nigeria having the foothold across part of Africa. Human capital is being developed, real estate is being developed, investment is being developed, and they can also be seen to serve as an agent for social change, as well as having to galvanize the youthful population, which are actually very relevant. And it's on record that in Africa, Africa has the highest youthful population in the world, which means how can we transfer these kind of skills into development process. This I'll be happy to talk more this during the Q&A. So trying to summarize, we looking at the issue of diversification was part of what Fosu tried to mention. Is very good to diversify if most develop within the AFTA and also FDI. And then another point I want to emphasize is the issue of mainstreaming the implementation of export policies and program into AFTA. Next one issue of there is need for more stakeholder engagement. Okay, gone are the days whereby we just bring policies and dump on the players. There's need to have such holistic stakeholder engagement for each of the actors. For example, I was having a discussion with export promotion in November, and I said, well, if you want to actually promote export, each player in that export sector need to be part of the process. So they see the policy as their own. There's this sense of ownership, and they can drive it. And then next point is what I mentioned in my previous slide, is that the need for youthful population, how we can harness them for development. And the digital skill presents us a kind of opportunity. You know, we are seeing the youths being savvy with digital skills, so they have such skills. How these skills can be channeled into productive use are important. Another discussion again that I'm seeing to discuss the issue of the possibility now have Africa 50 area, how we can begin to have educational system with marketable skills. In other words, is it possible to have a kind of a credit transfer system? I can do a course in Ghana and I bring it to Nigeria, or do a course in South Africa or in Kenya. So, of course, we don't have such scheme, but it's good to look into it. In other words, if I have a course I desire to that is not available in my country, I can go to a neighboring country, have such educational skill, and then transfer such skill to my base. So these are areas that are actually worthy of a discussion. Another one I've mentioned earlier of institutional framework. There's need for that to enhance accountability, enhance rule of law, and all of that part of it, which are very crucial for integration and also for FDI. So let me try to conclude. In conclusion, as I said, the development issues regarding AFTA and FDI are there, but then they can be mainstreamed to opportunities. So there's need to create an enabling environment that will encourage FDI and even domestic investment as well. And then there's need to engender value creation or upgrading. So in other words, if you're exporting raw materials, there's legal we can trade among ourselves. But when we're able to process our various goods, the trade component can be harnessed. And then I mentioned the issue of active stakeholder engagement, very important. And then strong institutional framework that will foster accountability are very important. Then there should be a mechanism to evaluate this process. For example, after 2 years, 3 years, there's need to evaluate how much we've achieved and after and what is left to be done, so we can know the kind of progress we are making. And then much more so, there's need to focus more on homegrown policies. In other words, each country to portray is contextual realities. Those after the central policy, but then each country will say, how do we domesticate such policy within our contextual reality? Very important. And then lastly, the issue to social services, capital development are very crucial for all of these to harness all the potential in AFTA and FDI. So on that note, I want to appreciate everyone for the attention. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you, Bessie. Obrigado. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot for an interesting presentation. So I'm going to start reading the questions from the chat. Can I ask all participants and my students as well, if anyone wants to ask any question, obviously you can let me know and I can relay the question. And then I have one question in the chat at the moment. Please feel free to add any questions you might have. So I'm going to read that one out. Questions for Professor Fosu. You said that FDI enhances export diversification if interacted with human capital. Nigeria is one of the largest recipients of FDI in Africa and also happens to have high levels of human capital, yet it has performed abysmally in terms of export diversification. Your result appears to be inconsistent with the Nigerian case. Would you agree?
No, obviously these results are on average. It must also be understood that's a partial effect. That is what I presented, human capital, but then Nigeria may also have dismal infrastructure. I will show you the result for infrastructure. So to get a whole story, we need to identify a set of attributes that are supposed to enhance the ability of FDI to increase export diversification. So if you take a partial picture, that picture does not represent the full picture. So that's why it will be very difficult to take a country like Nigeria. And as I showed you, you're right. There's no doubt that the record for diversification is quite weak in Nigeria, despite the fact that human capital is reasonably high, right? But the level of FDI is not really that important, because remember, we found that the level of FDI itself, actually, with a relatively low level of human capital and infrastructure, was not actually export diversification enhancing. So that's the point I'm trying to make.
Okay, can I add to it?
Please.
Yeah, thanks so much. Just to add to what Fosu has said, another area is the issue of the sectoral. If the true picture will come out, if you have a kind of a sectoral disaggregation of the FDI. We know most FDI in Nigeria are actually going to the mineral sector, which has little linkages to other part of the economy. So if you're able to disaggregate that FDI, that will the true picture will come out. Because the part of FDI will become much more relevant. We have FDI in other sectors apart from the mineral sector, which has little linkage with other sectors of the economy. So that's just what I want to add to it. Thank you.
Absolutely. If I may, absolutely. The problem is that normally you don't have sectoral FDIs, okay, that are comparable. But if you could have for a given country, then you'll be able to indicate. But then the question still remains: why does the FDI go into the natural resource area rather than elsewhere?
So on that point, so I just wanted to build on your model. You have an interaction actually, right, between human capital and FDI, and you interpret that as enhancing through the role of FDI. So I'm just wondering here, does the type of FDI then matter? Does the type of FDI in that, would you consider the natural resource sector, FDI going into the oil sector, for example, would you consider that a high human capital, high tech sector? And how does that relate to your conclusion then in that case?
Absolutely. Because what happens is that is the type of FDI that's picked up. And that type is a function of host country characteristics. It is not so much the level of FDI, it's a type. So the question becomes, how would a given type of FDI be picked up? And that's I didn't show the transformation function because I don't want to complicate matters anymore than I had. But the transformation function is there. Because the transformation function will indicate that FDI, the effect of FDI, not the level of FDI, but the effect of FDI is a function of host country characteristics, including human capital, including infrastructure, and so on. And so if we can pick up a number of these attributes, country attributes, then there will be the policy instruments. So if African countries want to attract ED enhancing FDI, then they must do the right things by having the appropriate policy instruments. Instead of just sitting there and giving a whole bunch of tax exemptions to FDI. So that's the point of it. But again, I must emphasize that is just a part of the whole puzzle. Okay, what I present to you is just a part of the puzzle, and researchers must proceed and engage in more research, discover the other parts of the puzzle. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm just going to read a couple of comments. Nigeria's government will have to take steps to make its various sectors attractive to FDI. I believe this to me like more than just the natural resource sector. And then from Professor Osaboyan, thanks for the suggestion. I totally agree with your thoughts. Sectoral disaggregation will give a better picture. It would be interesting to see, in fact, yeah, like, you know, if the interaction was to be played out in the regression with a sectoral disaggregation of FDI, how that would, I don't know if that data is available, obviously, but, you know, if that was available, it would be interesting to see. Okay, let me see. I have more questions, Professor Fosu, but I will ask a question to I have more questions for Augustin, but I'll ask a question to Evans first, and then we'll return to the FDI questions. Now, in your presentation, Evans, you were mentioning obviously that there is an issue of weak institutional frameworks, both hard and soft. I was wondering if you'd be able to perhaps expand on the challenges the legislation would pose specifically. Are we ready for a liberalization of movement in business in terms of intra-country trade and intra-country FDI in Africa or in the African countries involved in the agreement?
Thanks so much, Serena. Well, big question. Are we ready? I'll just give you a story. I had a conference in Togo, organized by YFM and the West African Economic Association. So let's go by road, so flying by air. Let's see how cross-border trade occurs in West Africa. And I think one of our colleagues on this call, Steve, has similar experience when he traveled from Accra to Lagos. So we're actually going on a bus from Lagos, Nigeria to Togo. And you will be surprised I want to study in the books and actually do what you see on the road. At each checkpoint, even though we are going on a diplomatic plate number, there were some challenges there and there. So, okay, are we ready? Yes, policy-wise, documentation-wise, we are ready. But just of a practicality, I'm afraid we are not there yet.
It's more the infrastructure you're saying, rather than the legislation.
Both for infrastructure. I know ECOWAS is making a move towards having a regional train that will run across the coastal region. In South Africa, they're also making a move that will run from the South Corridor, from even East Africa, from Tanzania down to even up to Mozambique. So the plans are actually there within each of the regional economic communities. Okay, but is taking the policy to action is actually what is apart from the issue of limited capital resource. There is also other issue, political will. Political will is not there yet. And so we have a measure of legislative and policy. If you look at these documents, they actually were spelled out. Okay, the framing, the stages, but political will. African leader will go to Addis and make all the kind of policies, but each country goes home and they begin to attack each other. So documentation, policy-wise, we are ready, but practicality, there is still yet to be done. There's still more to be done, both issues of infrastructure, soft and hard infrastructure, also sort of legislative applicability of these policies or the implementation of these policies are actually what we need to do. So what is a step in that direction, but we need to actually do more by having a strong political will that we push, so see it as a common goal, so we can push towards that common goal. That's what I would say. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you. Let's go back to some of the questions. Augustin, how did you arrive to a threshold of 3.5 years in your main findings, yet you use linear econometric models?
It just interaction, the usual, if we differentiate the export diversification, right, with respect to FDI, certainly it will be the FDI, if you were plus the coefficient FDI, then the coefficient of the interaction term times the level of human capital. Is the usual process, and then you solve for the human capital. If you assume that to be 0, you say that to equal 0, you solve for it, you get 3.5. Trust me, please. Trust me.
Okay.
If you have any doubt about that, you can certainly continue this on email. Send me email and I'll show you exactly how I did it.
Yeah, I think that would be a good idea. And also, so the next question is asking for recommendations on FDI, so textbooks for the issue of FDI specifically. I think this is best left through an email. So we'll definitely share the emails of the speakers for after.
Okay,
Someone was commenting on the yeah, that's fine. Yeah, so someone was commenting on the point that Evans brought. So there's a critical issue. Do we have uniformity of the legal system in place? What about the issues of cultural imbalance? But I sincerely think that we can start from somewhere, but we must embrace continuous improvement. So I should have read this first. So this is just to reinforce the point that we were making. So the policy is there. Even was saying the infrastructure is lagging slightly behind, but then someone is also raising the point of perhaps uniformity. I think I've lost some of the questions. So there is another question for Professor Fosu. The FDI goes to the oil sector because it is the most profitable. More so, the most profitable sector also attracts the best human capital. Just a statement, but it's been thrown at you.
Yes. Well, let's be careful. Certainly, the natural resource sector may not necessarily attract the best human capital, and it may not necessarily do that. And also, let's remember that some of this human capital is imported into the country. What we have here for human capital refers to human capital, domestic human capital, number of years capital. That's right. So that's the difference there, because I mean that's what really matters. I mean in that regard. So yes, it is possible that the natural resource sector would attract quite a bit of high-level human capital, but it's also true that other sectors in the economy, which would then diversify the economy, would also attract higher levels of human capital. Excuse me, FDI, the type of FDI that we're looking for. So the high level of human capital then will attract that type of FDI.
Okay. Are there any other questions? I have questions for both of you. How do you see the interaction between global value chains or global production networks and their current expansion within, within the whole of Africa, really, but some countries are more of a hub than others. I apologize for this ray of sun that's just in my eyes. So some countries obviously are more integrated in GPNS and GVCs than others. How does that interact with export diversification and with intra-trade? Do you think that we'll see more intra-African trade happening as global production networks increase, or will that continue reinforcing the trend of trade out from Africa?
It should improve both, if I may take a stab at this. It should actually improve both, no doubt about that. Given the fact that there will be quite a bit of reduction in tariffs across African countries, and hopefully non-tariff barriers to be reduced, and so if African countries have the right policies, obviously those hubs would possibly affect African countries, no doubt about that. But it should actually improve both.
Okay, thank you. I think to add to that is that both will increase, but I will seem to believe that the intra-regional trade the degree of intra-regional trade will be enhanced. For example, we have a more value chain created. There will be more variety. So there will be the issue of trade complementarity, issue of trade similarity will be addressed, and then we can, for example, if you have cocoa in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, there's less you can trade if you are trading cocoa beans. But when you have different kinds of chocolate, varieties of chocolate, then that can enhance trade between both countries, even though it's from cocoa derivative. But when it's been, the value chain enhances, the degree of tradability between both countries will enhance. So they improve both, yes, but the degree to which it improves regional trade I think should be enhanced more if it's well driven, with of course with a non-trade barrier being reduced, like a Fosu as a. Thank you so much.
I think it will crucially depend, right? I mean, so this is my own area of research. It is interesting to see how, depending once again on the type of FDI and the type of GPN,
Yeah.
it could go both ways. Export diversification, yes, certainly could increase, but then does it also matter what type of trade? Are we going to see more of the primary resource focus trade increasing, or are we going to see this GPNS increasingly focusing part of this production within African countries themselves? Then we will perhaps see more of the spillover onto trade as well. Yeah. I do wonder whether, once again, differentiating and disaggregating by sectors is the key there, right? But then which sectors? We probably need more insight into that.
Absolutely, definitely.
I have two more questions. Sorry, Augustin, did you want to add?
No, I agree with you pretty much. There's no doubt about that. But again, it depends on what African countries do, okay, to be able to make the inflows in terms of trade be more export diversification enhancing. I mean, that's critical there. And I think these are the kinds of things that we as researchers should be exploring.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. There's a lot of work for research to be done there. Another question for Augustine. Exports are typically undertaken by firms. How come you don't have firm level explanatory variables in your regression? And what are some of the firm level determinants of export diversification?
I do not, because I don't have the data. I certainly do not have the data. The data that I have is a macro data. Obviously, one could use firm level kind of data to do this analysis. But in the final analysis, what you're looking at is what are the policy instruments at the country level, right? It is not actually necessarily at the tree level, that is firm level necessarily. So this becomes on average, what do you expect to happen? Again, let me repeat that we don't have the micro in terms of firm level type of data to this type of analysis.
Just to add to that, I think such kind of a discussion can be taken at the level of micro levels. I think look at family, so I look at the country as a whole. So look at within country discussion, lot of firm level analysis. So you can look at the kind of firms, the ownership of the firms, and all of that. That will give us the micro impact. Also, just to follow with the last point is that I was also the service sector emerging much more even this era of after, because we have seen that kind of service sector emerging in Africa country, both Kenya, East Africa, like that. So the service sector may seem to be another emerging sector that will drive such a FDI and even intra-African regional trade. Thank you.
Okay, I'll perhaps take one last question that's already there for both of you. A greater share of Africa's exports tend to be natural resources in their raw form, extracted from, sorry, I've lost the question, extracted from FDI farms. Is it correct to say the value addition could perhaps be another initiative to enhance export diversification in Africa? So building on the point that we're making, export diversification, yes, but what type? So someone is asking, is it correct to say the value addition could be another initiative to enhance export diversification in Africa?
Yes, but this is actually part of intensive margin. That's the question, is about whether you talk about intensive margin or extensive margin, right? Yes, so value addition is an important factor which would improve the intensive margin. There's no doubt about that. So in other words, we're talking about giving a primary product, for example, and they have value addition to a manufactured product. I assume that's what the person is alluding to. And yes, that essentially, again, it's a component of export diversification. So the answer is yes, if I may.
Did you want to add anything, Evans?
No, I think I really agree. Like I said earlier, the value addition is quite, give us a truer picture, a clearer picture. Just I've mentioned the case of emerging service sector. So the more we have value addition, like I gave the case of cocoa bean, may not trade between themselves, but we can add value to that cocoa bean. They have very brands of chocolate. The trade opportunity will increase, unlike the raw materials.
Yeah, but we'll just have to see if people will actually like to eat it. I have a question from one of my students.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. I have a quick question.
That's okay. Yeah.
Question. I understand about the precondition and also the benefit that FDI would bring, but do you foresee any negative impact that the FDI brings to the host country?
Yes.
And if there's any negative, what are your recommendations to prevent those negative
impacts? May I, Serena, may I?
Yes, yes. Sorry, you couldn't actually see the students. I think the background prevents anyone else from.
I like the background too. I like to see your faces. Yeah. Again, there's no doubt that appropriate policies can try and rule out those negative impact FDI, if at all possible, right? Because what happens is, if indeed the business environment is weak, is poor and so on, then firms are less likely to come in with the kind of FDI that to enhance export diversification into the longer run. Usually these kinds of investment have a longer gestation period. So if the infrastructure is poor, the education level is poor, governance is poor, and so on, they'll just come in and have the kind of FDI that will be very quick. So they probably invest in maybe engage in some type of trading, if you will, as opposed to engage in actual production that will diversify the export situation. So again, the set of host country kinds of characteristics is sine qua non to ensure that you can rule out the potentially bad FDI. And also, we don't have any choice that this kind of FDI we can get. No, we have a choice. Because in the final analysis, it is a policy instrument that we utilize. It is a policy instrument that will bring in the type of FDI that are favorable to objectives.
Okay.
Can I add to that question?
Yes.
I think there are negative implications, but like Fosu mentioned, the degree to which we're able to use our institutional mechanism to control activities. One of the areas that normally the key area is the issue of environmental hazard. We are seeing that in Niger Delta in Nigeria, and the issue of in Mozambique, for example, the mining sector. Okay, but the domestic policies should be there to address such policies. Of course, I see some other big companies having issue of tax evasion here and there at all. So the policy, the strength of the policy or the law enforcement will be key in addressing the issue of environmental hazard, issue of civil service, social responsibility. And I'll just give this short story, and I will end it here. I remember when I was doing my PhD in Sweden, and I saw some buildings erected and endowed by these companies. And I asked my colleague, these companies are also in my country, but I hardly see any such endowment by these same companies. But the difference is that in Europe, there are policies to enforce such companies to do what they should do. But in this part of the world, such policies are not there to enforce them. Of course, you say that in institutional economics, human beings are not actually sent or angel. The policies are there to address, to direct such action of humans into doing what is right. Ordinarily, humans are not meant to do what is right until they are meant to do what is right, which is the what policies or instruments of the government are there to use that. So there are environmental hazard here and there, yes, but the domestic policies are very important to address such environmental issues. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I think I'll probably close the rounds of questions here, just because we are running out of time. Thank you very much for a very interesting seminar, for the very interesting presentations. And thank you from all the participants, especially from my students as well.
And thank you very much, Serena. If I may, thank you very much for organizing this event.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
well, thank you for everyone. Thank you, Fosu, again to meet you on this platform, and thank you, Serena, for wonderful presentation of this session. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you very much. Have a very good day, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.